For centuries, a strange name has echoed through maps, manuscripts, and legends: Tartaria. But the most unsettling question is not who they were, it is where they went. Older laces once marked enormous regions under that name, stretching across Asia and beyond. Then, almost overnight in historical memory, the empire seemed to vanish. That disappearance created a vacuum large enough for myths to grow. Some said Tartaria collapsed. Others insisted it was erased, hidden beneath new borders, new histories, and new rulers. To understand the mystery, you have to begin with the word itself. Tartary was not a small place on the edge of civilization. It was immense, vague, and powerful. European cartographers used it as a broad label for lands they barely understood. It covered steppe kingdoms, distant peoples, and territories that slipped beyond exact description. But vague names can become dangerous when later generations mistake them for a single nation. What began as a geographic convenience slowly turned into a historical ghost story. And that ghost story grew stronger because Tartary appeared on maps for generations. It was not a typo, not a one-time mistake, but a recurring presence. Then, by the 19th century, the label began fading from common use. The land did not vanish, but the old word slowly retreated into obscurity. That disappearance left modern readers with a puzzle. If Tartary was real enough to appear everywhere, why does it seem so absent now? The answer begins with geography. Much of the vast interior of Eurasia was mapped from afar through rumour, trade routes, and fragments of information. Foreign travellers wrote about Mongols, Tatars, and many other groups with little precision. To outsiders, one label could swallow entire populations and centuries of difference. So when later maps repeated the term, they preserved an outsider's shorthand, not a modern census or a clean political boundary. That distinction matters enormously. Yet the mystery refuses to die because some old references seem strangely persistent. They describe Tartary with such confidence that skeptics still pause. That is why conspiracy theories found fertile ground here. If the name survived so long, some argued, then maybe the people too were hidden rather than lost. But before we follow that path, we have to examine what the maps actually show. The cartographic record is messy, shifting, and deeply human. Many old maps were compiled from second-hand reports, copied again and again, until errors hardened into tradition. Once printed, a mistake could outlive the truth. Still, there were real peoples in those regions, with real states, armies, and dynasties. The trick is separating history from the fog of European labeling. Once you do that, the picture changes. Tartary becomes less a vanished super-empire and more a shifting umbrella over many cultures and powers. That does not make the mystery uninteresting. In fact, it makes it more fascinating because the gap between name and reality is where legends are born. And legends, once born, rarely stay small. They attract secret histories, lost civilizations, and the dream that someone, somewhere, buried the evidence. So the question becomes sharper. If there was no single vanished Tartarian nation, what exactly did later writers inherit, preserve, and then misread? To answer that, we need to track the last appearances of the name in official works. Those final mentions tell us more than the myths do. They show a world in transition, where old imperial vocabulary was giving way to newer classifications. In that transition, Tartary did not die dramatically. It dissolved, and that is precisely why the title still haunts us. When a name fades before the memory of the place does, people start asking who removed it. So the last Tartarians were not taken from the earth in a single night. They were taken, little by little, from the story itself. Once the memory of Tartaria began to fade, the question changed. It was no longer whether a vast civilization had existed, but who decided it should disappear from public sight. That is where the story becomes dangerous, because erasure rarely begins with violence. It begins with classification, with catalogues, and with the quiet power to name things differently. In the 18th and 19th centuries, explorers returned from Asia with descriptions that did not fit the official map. They spoke of enormous walls, buried cities, and names Europeans barely understood. Travellers told of a region once called Tartary, stretching across the great interior of Eurasia. On old European maps, the name covered an immense and uncertain world. Yet the maps were not neutral. They were tools of empire, And when the empires changed, so did the geography. Whole peoples could be absorbed into borders and then renamed out of history. The Romanovs, the Qing, and the Russian imperial state all needed stable narratives. A gigantic frontier, populated by many tribes, was easier to govern than a civilization that might rival them. So local identities were catalogued, subdivided, and translated into administrative language. What had once looked like a broad cultural horizon became a list of tribes, districts, and subjects. Missionaries added another layer. They described the interior as pagan, primitive, or unfinished, which made it easier to justify conquest while ignoring older and more complex traditions. But the people in those regions did not vanish. They remained on the land, speaking in layered tongues, keeping trade routes alive, and remembering origins no foreign archive could fully contain. That is why the disappearance of Tartary is so peculiar. If a civilization is truly gone, its ruins remain obvious, but if its name is stripped away, the land can still look ordinary. This is where the official records became useful. Census categories, ethnographic reports, and new place names began doing the work that armies and fire once did. Once an area is renamed, it becomes easier to claim that it was always something else. Over time, the old title survives only in maps, legends, and private memory. Meanwhile, archaeology was still young and often filtered through imperial ambition. Excavations were not always about truth. Sometimes they were about proving a story already chosen in advance. If a finding complicated the official narrative, it could be ignored, reinterpreted, or buried in a report few people would ever read. Many questions in history disappear that way. The Soviet period intensified this process. New ideologies wanted new beginnings, so old imperial categories were replaced again, this time with socialist ones that served a different power. Villages, languages, and folk customs were folded into republics and provinces. The older continental identity of Tartary was no longer useful, so it was broken apart and reassigned. Even the notion of a single Tartarian people became harder to defend. What survived was not a nation but fragments, architecture, oral tales, and strange references in forgotten books. This is why many later investigators focused on buildings. Domes, towers, and decorative masonry seemed to outlast official explanations, standing there like witnesses no one had cross-examined. But architecture alone cannot prove a vanished empire. A dome can be admired, restored, or repurposed, while the people who built and used it remain politically inconvenient. That is why so many Tartarian theories drift into speculation. When the paper trail is broken, imagination rushes in to fill the silence left by institutions. Some theories became fantastic, but their popularity revealed something real. People sense that an absence this large does not happen by accident alone. It usually has authors. The hardest part is that those authors did not need to destroy everything. They only needed to control schools, archives, maps, and the language people trusted. And once a generation grows up without the old frame of reference, the disappearance feels natural. The empty space becomes part of the landscape, and that is the final success of erasure. So when people ask where the last Tartarians were taken, the answer is unsettling. They were not simply moved somewhere else. They were broken into categories, borders, and silence. And that is why the question still lingers today. The people may have remained, but the name was carried away by empires that understood a simple truth: erase the label, and you can hide a world. To understand what happened to the last Tartarians, we have to move beyond myths and look at maps, ruins, and names deliberately changed by empires. By the 18th century, European cartographers still used Tartary as a vast label for lands they barely controlled, stretching across Siberia, Central Asia, and beyond. That label was not a precise nation. It was a convenient draw for tribes, towns, and kingdoms that outsiders could not or would not distinguish. In Russian documents, the word often narrowed into ta or vanished altogether, replaced by administrative categories designed to make diverse peoples easier to govern. Once the label shrank, the people behind it became harder to see. Entire communities were folded into broader ethnic terms, and local histories were overwritten. This is where the mystery deepens. The last Tartarians were not necessarily taken away in chains. In many cases, they were absorbed by bureaucratic language. But there were also literal removals. Russian expansion brought deportations, military resettlement, and population transfers that scattered Turkic and Muslim communities across the empire. In the steppe, mobility itself became a survival strategy. Families moved with changing borders, and over time, movement blurred the line between homeland and exile. By the 19th century, imperial censuses began fixing identities into rigid boxes. Once counted, people could be taxed, drafted, relocated, and renamed more easily. That counting process created a paper version of reality. It was neat, sortable, and deceptive because it could never fully capture language, lineage, or memory. Meanwhile, travelers brought back stories of magnificent brick cities, domed mosques, and caravan routes that linked the region to Persia, China, and India. Those routes mattered. They show that Tartary was never isolated wilderness, but a crossroads of trade, religion, warfare, and seasonal migration. Yet imperial officials rarely wanted crossroads. They wanted borders, so they replaced a living, mixed frontier with cleaner territorial stories on official maps. The result was not simple conquest, but compression. Whole histories were squeezed into provinces, and the word Tartary became a shadow of its former scale. Some communities were pushed toward assimilation, others toward resistance. In both cases, identity survived, but often under a different public name. That is why modern descendants can be hard to trace. The bloodline may remain, but censuses, migrations, and renamed districts scatter the trail. Archaeology adds another layer. Ruined mosques, mud brick walls, and buried city foundations prove there was once a dense urban world on the imperial edge. These sites matter because they contradict the old fantasy of empty land. The people were there, building, trading, praying, and burying their dead. But archaeology also reveals discontinuity. Sometimes a city was abandoned, sometimes destroyed, and sometimes rebuilt under a new administrative identity. That process helps explain why the last Tartarians is such a slippery phrase. It suggests disappearance, when in truth the transformation was often gradual. The empire did not always need to remove people physically. Sometimes it only needed to redraw the line, rename the district, and let memory fade. That is the quiet power of administrative control. It can make a civilization seem to vanish even while its descendants continue speaking, working, and remembering. So when we ask where they were taken, the answer is partly geographic, partly political, and partly archival. The record itself was moved, narrowed, and reinterpreted. The old Tartarian world was not erased in one dramatic event. It was broken apart by conquest, census, relocation, and the strategic shrinking of a name. And that is why the question still matters. The people may not have disappeared, but the world that named them was deliberately taken away. The trail does not begin in a prison camp or a battlefield. It begins in paperwork, where old names were quietly removed, one census line at a time. In the Russian Empire, Tartaria was never just a map label. It was a vast catch-all for lands, peoples, and languages that outsiders barely understood. That vagueness mattered. When an empire cannot define a people precisely, it can also erase them precisely by redesigning the language around them. By the 19th century, explorers, administrators, and ethnographers were all carving up the same immense frontier, with different labels and different motives. Some described the steppe as a civilization's edge. Others saw a space to be measured, taxed, catalogued, and eventually absorbed into the state. That process was not neutral. Once a region entered official statistics, it also entered the logic of control, conscription, resettlement, and surveillance. Railways accelerated that power. Once tracks reached the interior, movement became easier to manage, and populations became easier to redirect. New forts and settlements appeared where old routes once disappeared into grass and dust. The frontier was not empty, it was being rewritten, and inside that rewriting, old tribal and regional identities were often folded into broader categories that served the empire better than the people themselves. One of the most important tools in this process was the ethnographic survey. Men with notebooks decided who belonged to which group and why, but those notebooks were not innocent. They translated living communities into fixed boxes, and fixed boxes are easy to count, move, and control. In some regions, Islam, language, and clan structure mattered more to daily life than any imperial census category. Yet the state kept forcing the categories anyway. That tension created a historical trap. A people could remain physically present while their older identity was divided, diluted, or reassigned on paper. This is why the question of the last Tartarians is so slippery. The disappearance was not always physical. Sometimes it was bureaucratic, linguistic, and political. The Soviet period intensified that logic. New republics, new borders, and new ethnic labels promised order, but they also fragmented older continuities. In that system, names became political instruments. To be counted one way could mean privileges, school access, military duty, or internal exile. Meanwhile, local memory did not vanish so neatly. Oral histories kept older identities alive, even when official form said otherwise. That gap between memory and record is where modern confusion grows. Researchers find a vanished nation on paper, then discover its descendants were never gone at all. And that is exactly what the Tartarian question exposes. It is not only about where a people went, but who was allowed to name them afterward. Because once a name is reassigned, history begins to look clean. The violence of the transition disappears behind a neat administrative vocabulary. Yet in the archives, old travel accounts, maps, and demographic tables keep betraying the effort. They preserve the traces that official simplification wanted gone. That is why the last Tartarians remain hard to locate. Their end was fragmented across empires, republics, and statistical revisions. What survives is not a single dramatic vanishing, but a long administrative erosion. First the label thins, then the category, then the memory of the category itself. So the answer to the title's question is unsettlingly simple. They were taken into categories, districts, and new identities that made them harder to see. The last Tartarians were not simply lost. They were dispersed, renamed, and archived into obscurity, leaving behind a mystery that paperwork still cannot fully bury. By the final years, the question was no longer where Tartaria had gone. It was what authorities wanted people to forget before anyone could ask again. The empire did not vanish in one dramatic collapse. It was broken into districts, renamed, and folded into new systems that made the old world harder to trace. Once that process began, the name Tartary started to disappear from public language. In its place came safer labels, cleaner categories, and official silence. That silence was not accidental. It was bureaucratic, repeated, and effective enough to make a civilization seem like a rumor after only a generation. In frontier regions, whole communities were reassigned under new administrations. Families who had lived under one banner for centuries suddenly answered to another. Resettlement papers turned identities into entries. A person was no longer a descendant of Tartaria. They were now a subject, a laborer, or a statistic. And once the paperwork changed, memory changed with it. New generations inherited the new labels and rarely saw the older ones anywhere at all. Even where old stories survived, they were pushed into folklore. What had once been administrative reality became something spoken about in whispers. At the same time, railways and roads penetrated the old territories. Movement became faster, but also easier to monitor, register, and redirect. The same routes that connected the land also carried officials, inspectors, and census workers. They came to measure populations that had once been known by older names. Census categories mattered because once a group was entered under another identity, the older one could be declared non-existent. Paper could erase people without moving them at all. That is how a people can be hidden in plain sight, not by annihilation alone, but by translation into categories that no longer sound historical. Some descendants drifted into cities where old local identities dissolved into larger labor populations. The record no longer said Tartarian. It said urban resident, worker, migrant. Others were dispersed into rural districts and border zones where isolation made verification difficult. Distance became one of the state's most useful tools. In those places, a family could survive while its origin slowly faded from official view. By the time anyone checked, the line had already been recast. Meanwhile, historians inherited a fractured archive. One shelf held imperial maps, another held local reports, and the links between them had been deliberately weakened. That fracture explains why the search becomes so difficult. If the archive was sorted to obscure continuity, then absence itself was engineered evidence. And yet traces remain. A misspelled name here, a migration note there, an old photograph labelled with a modern category instead of the original one. Each trace suggests not extinction, but redistribution. The last Tartarians were taken into systems large enough to hide them inside ordinary life. That is why the question in the title matters. They were not taken to one place, but into many places where identity could be diluted and renamed. The taking was administrative, not theatrical. It happened through forms, trains, new districts, and altered categories until the old identity stopped appearing in plain language. So the answer is unsettlingly simple. The last Tartarians were taken into the machinery of state, where names are changed before bodies are ever noticed. That machinery did what conquest often does best. It turned people into administrative dust. Once scattered, the old Tartarian world became difficult to restore from memory alone. But restoration begins with refusal. Refusal to accept a cleaned-up map, refusal to trust a silent archive, and refusal to let disappearance masquerade as destiny. If the Tartarians were taken anywhere, they were taken into obscurity by design, and the final act of recovery is to say their absence was not natural, but manufactured.